China is a country that has experienced significant economic growth and modernization in recent decades, but this progress has come at a cost to the country's human rights record. As the Chinese government has been known to crack down harshly on dissent and criticism, particularly when it comes to political or social issues that challenge their authority. Protests are one such form of dissent that has been met with repression in China. Despite constitutional provisions that guarantee freedom of assembly and expression, protests are often seen as a threat to social stability and are quickly suppressed. Protesters are subjected to arbitrary detention, physical violence, and even disappearances, making it difficult for them to voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Welcome to Around the World, and today we will be looking at the reasons why Xi Jinping is finished and why the CCP is terrified of the protests in China. China has long been known for its strict control over public dissent and protests. So when thousands of people took to the streets in the southern Chinese city of Guangzhou in February 2022 to protest against the local government's plans to expand a waste incinerator, it sent shockwaves through the country's ruling Communist Party. The protest in Guangzhou, which is one of China's largest and wealthiest cities, was peaceful, but it was also one of the largest protests in the country in recent years. It is estimated that thousands of people participated in the demonstration, which lasted for several days and included sit-ins and rallies. The protesters were demanding that the local government abandon its plans to expand the waste incinerator, citing concerns about air pollution and its impact on public health. Sadly, the Chinese government has responded to the protest with a mix of repression and conciliation. While some protesters have been arrested and charged with disrupting social order, the local government has also promised to halt the expansion of the waste incinerator and to hold public hearings to address residents' concerns. But why has this protest in Guangzhou worried the Chinese government? There are several reasons. Firstly, the protest comes at a time of growing public discontent in China. See, the country has experienced rapid economic growth in recent decades, but this growth has also led to widespread environmental degradation and a growing wealth gap. Many Chinese citizens are becoming increasingly frustrated with the government's failure to address these issues, and protests like the one in Guangzhou are a reflection of this discontent. Besides that, the protest in Guangzhou was organized and carried out largely through social media, which makes it more difficult for the government to control and suppress. Although China's Great Firewall blocks many foreign social media platforms, Chinese citizens have developed their own platforms that are more difficult for the government to monitor and censor. Another reason the protest in Guangzhou is significant is that it took place in one of China's wealthiest and most developed cities. Guangzhou is a symbol of China's economic success, and the fact that residents of the city are protesting against the government's policies suggests that even the country's most prosperous regions are not immune to public discontent. However, the scariest part for the Chinese government is that the protest in Guangzhou could inspire similar protests in other parts of the country. This is because it came at a time when protests over environmental issues have become increasingly common in China, and the Guangzhou protest could serve as a model for other communities that are facing similar issues. In actuality, there are a number of things the people of China could protest. For example, Chinese citizens have become increasingly aware of these environmental problems, and they are demanding that the government take action to address them. However, the government's response has been slow and inadequate, leading to growing frustration among the public. Protests over environmental issues have become increasingly common in China in recent years. For example, in 2013, thousands of residents in the southern city of Xifang took to the streets to protest against plans to build a copper plant. The protest was eventually successful, with the local government canceling the project. Following that, in 2019, protests erupted in the eastern city of Jinan over plans to build a waste incinerator. The fact that protests over environmental issues have become more common in China is significant because it reflects a broader trend of growing public discontent with the government's policies. And as such, in addition to environmental issues, Chinese citizens are also becoming more vocal about other issues, such as corruption, censorship, and human rights abuses. The reasons why people in China may be protesting are growing and now vary depending on the specific issue or event that has sparked the protest. However, there are several common grievances that have led to protests in China in recent years. One of the most significant issues that has led to protests is government corruption and abuse of power. See, many Chinese citizens have grown increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived lack of accountability and transparency, as well as its suppression of dissent and opposition. Another common reason for protests in China is economic inequality and labor rights. Despite China's rapid economic growth, many citizens feel that they have been left behind or exploited by the country's capitalist system. This has led to protests over issues such as low wages, unsafe working conditions, and a lack of access to affordable housing. Human rights abuses are also a significant concern for many Chinese citizens. See, in recent years, China has been criticized by the international community for its treatment of minority groups such as Tibetans and Uyghurs, as well as for its censorship of the internet and restriction of freedom of speech. Sadly, it's important to note that protests are tightly controlled in China, and the government often uses its security forces to suppress dissent. As a result, many protests may not receive widespread coverage or attention outside of China. The Chinese government has a history of treating protests with a heavy hand. In general, protests are tightly controlled and often met with a swift and forceful response from the authorities. The government's response to protests can vary depending on the size and nature of the protest, as well as the location and level of media attention. For example, protests in Beijing and other major cities are typically more closely watched and tightly controlled than those in more rural or remote areas. In many cases, the government will deploy riot police, security forces, and other law enforcement agencies to disperse protesters and maintain order. Protesters may be arrested, beaten, or detained without trial, and there have been reports of torture and other forms of mistreatment. The Chinese government also uses a range of tactics to suppress dissent and discourage protest, including censorship, propaganda, and surveillance. For example, the government has strict controls on the media and the internet, and social media platforms are monitored and censored to prevent the spread of information that is critical of the government. Overall, the Chinese government views protests as a threat to social stability and national security, and is often quick to take aggressive action to suppress them. As a result, many people in China are hesitant to participate in protests, fearing reprisals from the authorities, which on its own speaks to the severity of the problem, as these same people are now protesting the government. So much so that even the effective and scary methods used by the government against protests have not been enough to satisfy the public and deter the protests, as people still pour into the streets and stand for what they feel is right. And as such, protests like the one in Guangzhou are likely to continue unless the government takes more decisive action to address public concerns. In recent years, protests in China have not been uncommon, and they reflect the widespread social and political grievances of the people. However, the Chinese government has a history of tightly controlling dissent and opposition, and protesters and activists often face severe punishment for exercising their rights to free speech and peaceful assembly. The handling of protests by the Chinese government raises serious concerns about human rights and political freedoms in the country. It is essential that the international community continues to monitor and speak out against the suppression of protests and dissent in China, and to advocate for greater respect for human rights and civil liberties in the country. However, many have remained silent to date, as it is important to keep a good relationship with the Chinese government. So it raises the question, how long is the world willing to stand by as the people of China fight for their rights? But what do you think? Are the protests a step in the right direction, or is the country heading for a much grimmer future? Let us know in the comment section below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the video. While you're here, why not check out this video? Until next time, bye.